Okay, good day, everybody. Good evening, good morning, depending on where you're joining from in the world. It's really my pleasure to be with you today and to welcome you to this very exciting session. Thank you for joining us. As a partner of the TNOC Festival, on behalf of AIPH, I would like to firstly welcome you to the broader festival. I think we can all agree that it's been very well curated and put together. And, myself, I was very impressed by the Topia world that I think we've all navigated to get to the various sessions. I just want to take this moment to welcome you all to the session and give you a really thank you for being with us today. We have a really exciting discussion that we're going to be having today with a really exciting lineup of speakers as well. Without further ado, I'll just say a few words of introduction and give a little bit of context to the session. So today's session is entitled Connecting Cities with the Horticultural Industry, Bridging the Divide to Harness the Power of Plants. And we're really thrilled to be starting this conversation and to really be hearing from a wide range of different respondents and attendees, and we hope to hear from you as well. So just a couple of house rules before we dive in and get started. This Zoom session will be recorded. So by being here, you are consenting to being on record. I believe the recording has already started. So just to inform you that is the case. But thank you for being with us. And just to really encourage everyone on the call to please feel free to make use of the chat box throughout the session. If you have any thoughts, if you'd like to address them to particular speakers or ask just in general, you are welcome to do so in the chat box. I have encouraged each of our speakers to respond in the chat box, although they will be speaking in the roundtable discussion. So we may have some that we'll leave for the end, at which point we will, at the end, we will open the floor for questions from the audience. So you can either wait until that point or you are more than welcome to ask your questions throughout the session in the chat box. By means of introducing the session, I just wanted to firstly introduce myself. My name is Timothy Blatch and I'm a Green City consultant for AIPH, the International Association of Horticultural Producers. I'm actually an urban planner by profession and by qualification. But very much my passion has been at the nexus of people and nature and cities since the beginning of my career. So I'm really thrilled to be working alongside the AIPH team and to be bringing this exciting green city work to life alongside the rest of the team. So AIPH is, as I've said, the International Association of Horticultural Producers, and we position ourselves as the world's champion for the power of plants. Really, AIPH has united horticultural producers in an international community that thrives to this day, having been founded in 1948. As we know, much has changed in that time, and our bond and relationship with nature is certainly weakening as a result of many different factors. And this is where AIPH really strives to reignite and uphold an appreciation of plants and really inspire the world, with the love of plants and the various ways in which plants can enrich our lives. Diving a little bit deeper, our Green City program is really where we are kickstarting our Green City work. It's through this program that we've brought many exciting things to life, such as our Green City guidelines, and also for some of you who may be aware, the AIPH World Green City Awards, which we are currently in the middle of the inaugural edition of. What you can see on your screen is just a brief timeline of that first award session. You can see that the 14th of March deadline has recently passed, and we are thrilled to say that we've had a very impressive amount of interest from cities from around the world. And you can see that throughout the course of this year, before we launch the next edition, we will be announcing the shortlist from this round following a technical panel and jury selection process before announcing the winners at an event to be held in September or October this year. Through our Green City work, we are really recognizing that there's a growing understanding for the need for the horticultural industry to be positioned and have a a strong seat at the global green city table. We know that cities are doing amazing work for nature, and we hope to recognize and celebrate this work through our work on the AIPH Green City program. We also know that plants play a critical role in our increasingly urban lives. They have potential to deliver multiple benefits and really enrich our day-to-day lives in cities. We also, that being said, we know that as cities grow and many factors are at play, nature is diminishing at alarming rates. And it's, through this recognition that we are really hoping to contribute to the work that many of our partners and others are doing around the world to really inspire a global movement for greener cities. Inspire, have cities inspire one another as to what is possible. And really what we work to do is position plants right at the core and in the center of this work. So building on this, premise, I just wanted to challenge all of you here. We know that cities are making ambitious commitments to planting millions of trees over the next few years and next decades. And I just want us to consider and ponder for a moment, where will all of these plants come from? So, building on that thought, we at AIPH strongly believe in the power of plants and the need for them in our lives and in our cities. It's building on this, that we believe that plants are the foundational elements that make up the nature that we critically depend on and are essentially a part of. So, through our partnership with TNOC, we've really had enjoyed a really good relationship with the TNOC team, and they have, been a very core partner to our Green City work. And through that, we are really excited to bring this session to life. So just to run through the session agenda, I'm handling the welcome and opening now. I'm going to just do a little introduction as to where this session and these speakers in particular have come from. And then we are going to have a facilitated panel discussion with the speakers. We aim for this discussion to take place in a bit of an informal manner, allowing us to all just share our insights and our ideas and our views. And really we hope for just a rich time of being together as we share this amazing content. Thereafter, as I mentioned before, we will open the floor to questions from the audience before we close the session. So before we get started, I just wanted to let everyone know, and Audrey, I think, will share a link in the chat box, that essentially this session has had a bit of a history. Recently, we, AIPH, in connection with TNOC, delivered a roundtable, which, if you know, I don't think anyone on the call will be a stranger to TNOC and the amazing work they do in these roundtables, gathering diverse responses to a certain prompt or question. So we, really set out, you can see at the top of your screen, can we enable better decision-making when it comes to urban plants selection and preparation? Does urban ecology and the horticultural industry need to be better engaged with each other? It's really on that premise that we set out to co-host a roundtable where we ask the prompting questions of a diverse range of respondents, and you can see that question on your screen. We can't achieve greener cities without better consideration for plants and stronger connections with the horticultural industry. And we asked respondents, do you agree, and please share your insights. As a result of this, we had an amazing response to this roundtable, and many fantastic views and insights were expressed. And through that, this particular session came to life at the festival. We really want to take this opportunity to share with you some of the responses that we received, and allow some of the speakers to elaborate on their insights and to be able to discuss them with one another. So before we get started, I just wanted to build on that and offer everyone on the call the opportunity to also contribute and have their views heard as well on this question. So we're going to run a poll, and we'll be using Mentimeter to do so. Audrey has put the link in the chat box, so please, if you could click that link. And the question is, we can't achieve greener cities without better consideration for plants through stronger connections with the horticultural industry. Do you agree? So I'll just give a moment for everyone to put in their vote before we share some results. Okay, it may not allow me to share the results. I think that Audrey is going to kindly make an attempt to share the results in the chat box with us. So I don't want to ponder, stay too long or get stuck on this. But thank you all for your responses, and Audrey will post the results in a second through the chat box. On that note, it's really my pleasure to introduce to you our distinguished speakers for today. I'm calling them speakers, but really, we welcome them just as guests to the session. And our first is Andrew Grant, the founder and director of Grant Associates. You can see a short bio for him on your screen. Andrew is a landscape architect who's worked, work is based around the reconnection of people to nature. He's led the design team for the Gardens by the Bay in Singapore project, and is currently involved in various other projects around the UK and even, throughout Europe. So Andrew, really, it's my pleasure to welcome you today, and thank you for being with us. We also have Darby McGrath with us today, and she's the Senior Research Scientist for Environmental Horticulture at Vineland Research and Innovation Centre. Darby has done a couple of things with AIPH before, and we really are thrilled to have her with us today. She's also the leader of the newly launched Greening the Landscape Research Consortium at Vineland. So Darby, a huge warm welcome to you, and thank you for being with us today. Next, we have Peter Massini, Director of Future Nature Consulting. And we've also, had the pleasure of working with Peter on a number of different things, and for a couple of years now. Peter is an urban ecologist and green infrastructure strategist, policymaker, and practitioner with a long career in this space, with lots of insights to share, and is currently a consultant advising public and private sector clients on how to create greener and more resilient cities and landscapes. Peter, thank you very much for your time and for being with us today. It's really a pleasure to have you. We also have Matthew Morrow with us, Director of Horticulture in the Department of Forestry, Horticulture and Natural Resources at NYC Parks. Matthew is a lifelong gardener, and I've just given his title. And Matthew is working to create tools to help gardeners and designers increase biodiversity in urban gardens by appending traditional horticulture, which has many sins to atone for. I think we'll hopefully hear about some of his insights on that, and steering the city towards ecological gardening and landscape management. Matthew, it's really a pleasure to have you here, and we thank you for being with us. We were going to have Iain Shears with us. I'm not sure yet if he has joined the call or not. He may be tied up in something else and may join in a couple of minutes. We hope that he does, but Iain is the principal at Iain Shears Green Infrastructure and Urban Forestry, and is one of Australia's leading experts in urban landscapes and forestry, specializing in urban landscapes for over 25 years, and with an extensive portfolio of work with the city of Melbourne. So Iain, if you are with us, or if you join us, it's wonderful to have you with us too. And last but not least, Maria Aragão, technical support to the Board of Directors in the Portuguese Association of Landscape Architects. Maria, it's wonderful to have you with us. We are so thrilled to have you join us today and to hear some of your thoughts. And having studied in the United States, Maria is currently providing technical support to the Board of Directors, and is also, I can see, a TNOC Festival 2022 curator, and running a small private practice, raising 2 boys, 2 dogs, 3 cats, and 3 chickens. So thanks for sharing that with us. It certainly sounds like you have your hands full, but we really look forward to hearing your views and insights today. So on that note, I think we'll dive straight into the panel discussion. Where we really just want to keep this informal and hear from our speakers. Firstly, have them share their insights that they shared in the TNOC Roundtable, and I believe that link is in the chat box for anyone on the call to please, we encourage you to check it out, read the responses, and there is also a comment section at the bottom where you can contribute your views to the discussion. I think when you start to read through it and go through some of the responses, you'll certainly agree that there is a wealth of knowledge between the different respondents and a fantastic couple of insights and ideas that have been raised. So we really look forward to continuing that conversation with everyone, even after this session online on the TNOC website. So without further ado, I'll dive into the panel discussion, and I have a couple of prompting questions I will ask of each of our speakers. But as I said before to each of the speakers, please feel free to come in and share your thoughts and responses to each other as well. So maybe Maria, if I could start with you. Maybe just zooming out and taking a bit of a bigger picture perspective to open, why is it critical to restore our relationship with the natural world, and in particular, restore our relationship with plants? I'll lead from that into a follow-up on what role might the horticultural industry play alongside cities in the transition to a more sustainable and resilient future where we have a better relationship and are more connected to plants. Over to you, Maria.
Yes, well, again, like I mentioned in the roundtable, I think that human beings have for a while separated themselves from the connection with nature, which is now proven that has been a mistake. I think that one thing has been good about COVID is that it's shown people the need to connect with nature. When people were forced to be locked inside, they all of a sudden realized that, that connection is just part of who we are, and that is something that we need to make sure that we maintain and that we promote. And oftentimes we have to restore because it hasn't been existing. So, we've built our cities separate from nature, and we now have to make sure that we get that connection back, because we just will not be able to have a successful, healthy, resilient life in the cities if we don't have that connection with nature. And plants are part of that, even though, as far as I'm concerned, the whole natural cycle is something that we need to look for. Plants play a big part in it, because not only do they provide the support for other species, like insects and birds, and to just come to the urban environment and live alongside with people, but they also give us the things that we so often take for granted that make life in the city bearable, like shade, just to listen to the trees rustle with the wind, and all of those things that are just innate to human nature. So as far as the horticultural industry, I think that is, for sure, of the utmost importance, because they are the professionals that make those plants for us. We think of them as existing, but they don't really exist if somebody is not there preparing them for us to use. And me as landscape architect, we use them as tools in what we do, and we need to have somebody that is preparing them for us to use and is preparing what we want to use. So to make sure that we have this strong connection, this talk back and forth between users and producers, and so that we can have available what we want to be available. And I had mentioned the use of native plants. It's now been more, they're more available, but they're still not quite as readily available as one would like. And so that's where I think the connection with the horticultural industry comes.
Fantastic. Thanks, Maria. I really like what you said about the stronger connections between the users and the producers. I think that's a point that we'll hopefully get to flesh out a little bit more as the conversation develops. But thanks for starting us off. That's a really great start. I just want to check if Iain is on the call. Iain, are you there? I can't see. It doesn't look like it. So I'm going to field some of the questions we had prepared for Iain, open them to the floor and combine them with others to hear from the rest of our speakers. So maybe Peter, I can ask you, I'm going to throw a bit of a provocation at you. As urban and environmental practitioners and change makers, regardless of what sector we work in, we're all, working together, hopefully, to respond to the global imperative to bring more nature into our cities and into our lives. We know nature is diminishing and needs to be conserved and restored. We also know that we need to act now. But all of this is quite easy to say and to acknowledge at the strategic level. And advocacy, I would argue, is at an all-time high at the moment, with CBD negotiations ongoing, etc. But the question I really want to ask you in response to that provocation is do we know what this means at a practical level? Do cities know? Do the practitioners who are changing our cities know how to take this further at the practical level? And my question to you then, Peter, is the global green city community welcomes bold commitments by politicians. We have many who are coming out with these huge visions and huge ambitions of planting millions of trees and restoring huge amounts of habitat. But we are asking the question, where do these commitments consider how these ambitions are going to be achieved, again, at that practical level? And where will all these plants come from to meet them? And I'll ask you then to reflect, is the horticultural industry aware of these commitments and ready to supply the plants to meet these ambitions? Over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Timothy. The short answer to the first part of the question about how can those ambitions be achieved, or are policymakers and politicians aware of the practicalities? The short answer is no. And I say that having worked for the City of London Authority for 10 years as a policymaker, working with politicians. And as you say, we put together a fantastic policy framework and did a lot of advocacy. But I think I'd be the first to admit that we weren't really fully aware of issues around things like supply chains. How do you actually get an industry up and running to be able to deliver on those ambitions? And things like trees, I think that, particularly in the UK, there's been quite a good sort of lobby and group of producers who have focused on trees, because lots of local authorities in the UK have been planting street trees for many years. But I think the sort of wider horticulture industry are less aware of both the ambitions of politicians and policymakers, and perhaps hesitant about the how deep those commitments might be in terms of, do they actually set up those supply chains? Do they actually get those materials ready for that big increase in planting and greening of cities? Now, I think in London, where I worked for 10 years, we have demonstrated that some of the policies we put in place are certainly resulting in a significant demand for those plants to do the urban greening. But again, I think we didn't really think through the consideration around how do we ensure the industry is ready and prepared to provide those materials as those policies begin to be implemented. We should have spent more time thinking about those issues, I think, rather than focusing just on the policy, because in a way the policy is the easy bit. Once you convince a politician, it's a good thing to do. People like myself who are policymakers have to craft the policy wording, but it's actually then following through the practicalities, which is the difficult piece. And again, we were unaware of the complexity of things like supply chains to enable that to happen.
Yeah, great, thanks, Peter. Darby, I'm going to flip that straight onto you and ask you about, Peter's mentioned this critical supply chain issue, and how complex it can be. So, I'll ask you to just reflect on Peter's thoughts, but also ask you, in your view, has the growing green city movement, with all these commitments and cities becoming more green and more sustainable, has this resulted in an increase in demand for the products from the industry? And should it? If not, how could we make sure that it does? How do we get that relationship right that Maria spoke about?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I'm glad that it's top of mind for everyone right now. So I'm from Canada, and right now we have a 2 billion tree commitment from our federal government. And so what we can see is that there's all sorts of interest, certainly, in increasing canopy cover targets to align ourselves with this new planting goal. And one of the things that we're really seeing, and as a researcher we've been exploring, is trying to understand what Peter was talking about, which is this complexity that underpins, what's often considered to be a supply chain, but actually operates a lot more like a value chain, because we understand now from some of the work that we've been doing that, the communication, the collaboration, the knowledge mobilization, all of those pieces are as critically important as the actual physical transfer of materials or products to the landscape. And so I would say it's great. We need the policy to be sort of the market pull that's pulling more and more resources towards horticulture, producing more trees and more vegetation that supports our urban landscapes. But to Peter's point, it's really complex. And, there's not always a consideration that's given to something like, the effort it takes in terms of time, resources, especially time, of changing market demands. So if we are shifting towards more native trees as part of our urban forest management strategy, in some cases in parts of Canada, it can take 7 to 10 years to finish a tree for an urban landscape. So, all of a sudden doing a pivot and asking nurseries to be growing new and different things, we have to align ourselves with what that actually looks like in reality. So this idea of the practicality of it is really, really important. And so on that note, we do see changing demands. We see differences in terms of the levels of maintenance that people are willing to put into their private landscapes as well as the public landscapes. And that, certainly is aligned with, the challenges that we're seeing with respect to climate change and efficiencies and all of those things. But from our perspective, from the work that we've been doing on this, we really do need to understand how complex that is. And it's this idea that we all have to sort of be moving at the same pace, because some of the trees that we're seeing, increases in terms of the demand from consumers, we may not even have in propagation yet. And we have to really start to forecast that stuff out. And then, it just comes down to like total numbers as well. So if all of a sudden we're looking at increasing our planting demand, we really do have to understand where the nursery sector is at in terms of being able to address that. And I think even, in terms of the policy side from the federal government, 2 billion trees is really, really amazing. It's great to see the commitment. But 2 billion urban trees is a very different thing than 2 billion trees that are part of an afforestation strategy. So, unpacking all of that is critically important to the success of this, and also for us to actually meet these targets. I mean, it's in a really important time. We need to be doing this properly. And so I would say we're at the start. We certainly are not at the finish.
Great. Well, you certainly paint a picture of hope. And Maria, I'm going to come back to you for a second and see if we can flip, a little bit what Darby's just said, and look at it from the point of view of the horticultural industry. I'd like you to just reflect on, we're hearing from Peter, from Maria, all these commitments that governments are making. What benefits might the horticultural industry derive, from these buzzwords of green cities and sustainability and this move to, restore ecosystems? And are these benefits, in your view, being realized at present? And if not, what do we need to do to do so more effectively?
I don't think they are. And I think it's because of that lack of communication that, we have been talking about. Maybe we ought to have thought about that beforehand, I guess, but it is happening a lot that, designers are probably demanding certain, like Darby just mentioned, right? Demanding certain plants are just simply not available. And I think that it will be great if the horticultural industry could be on the same page as the designers, because it could only benefit them, right? I mean, the horticultural industry is, it's finicky, right? I mean, you can, bad weather might mean like the devastating year for the horticultural company industry, right? So if they're producing all of these plants that aren't being used, that's also terrible, because then they're getting all this overflow of plants that are just not being used. On the other hand, designers are looking for certain plants that they can't find locally, and they have to go and outsource, and I know that within Europe is a different scale that, for instance, like you mentioned before, I worked in the United States, and it's a different scale, but within Europe, you have to go outside to other countries when you could really produce those in-house, right? And that is something that I think needs to be worked on at. I mean, it's not, I think it's something that everybody wants. And I just think that it's just difficult to get the process of this talk going. And, it's just work in progress. And I think if we get there, everybody will benefit, including the people that live in the cities, right? In the end, that's what matters the most. So we would all be better if we could have that better communication. And again, I think that we need to help the horticultural industry, because I think that at least in Portugal, I don't know how it is in the rest of the world, but I know that in Portugal, in this past few years have been pretty complicated. And I think that it's very important for us designers to take our part in that, to make sure that we help them to move forward in the right, well, in a common direction, right? It's not the right direction, the wrong direction, just the common direction, so we can both all work in the same, flow, right? Towards the same goal. So we're not like rowing in different directions, right? So we have the boat going around in circles, so we can just move forward towards this thing that we all want, greener cities. We now know it's important, and we just have to make sure we get there. Again, like Peter was saying, we all know what it is that we want. We just have to implement it, and implementation is not often as easy as as one would expect. So.
I mean, what I'm hearing from you all is really the complexity of this issue. Green cities itself is so complex, let alone the complexity of the industry as well. So bringing those together, I think, what is clear is if we could get that system working, and as you say, not rowing in two different directions, there is huge benefit, not only for the industry, for cities themselves, but also for as you mentioned now, urban residents, Maria. So, I think that's the sort of end game. This, I think to a lot of people, and perhaps even some on the call, they'll be, this all might seem quite logical and, something that should automatically be happening. But I'm going to turn to you now, Andrew, for a second and ask you, why is the horticultural industry critical in enabling successful urban greening projects? And see with you, you've had such a wealth of experience in implementing these types of projects. Can you share some insights in terms of how the role of the industry has enriched those and why it's critical to this space?
Thanks, Timothy. Yeah. I think one of the things that strikes me is that the horticulture industry, it's a commercial industry. It's about business, it's about economy, it's about employment. And I think, that's one of the things that is a huge opportunity, I think, for urban greening across the world, in terms of how the horticulture industry can actually rise to that challenge and actually sort of basically benefit cities, not just in terms of the environmental, social benefits that come off the back of plants, but actually how do we, create a horticultural industry that drives part of the economy of a place. And I think what's interesting for me is that as we get into more fine analysis of what it means to have a green city, what are the appropriate nature-based solutions for different cities, different places, different environments, you can begin to see that the horticultural industry might actually start to adapt to those more specific opportunities, whether it's a region, a country, or whatever. And I think there's a fine-tuning process to go on, which will then pick up the issues of native species, or what are the appropriate species that we need to grow to deliver all of these fantastic plans. And I think the other thing as well, which I think is relevant, it's not just about the species, it's about actually the growing process, isn't it? It's about, you know, if we want to specify peat-free or material that hasn't been sort of developed with pesticides and herbicides and, you know, minimize plastics, all those sort of things, that's also part of that sort of process. I think one final thing, just in terms of the, you know, I mean, having a successful horticultural industry delivering these things, it's basically minimizing risk in various ways as well, particularly if we're sort of really focused on these more local supply chains, you know, that trying to mitigate risk of biosecurity issues, mitigate risk of not being able to deliver the number of plants that Peter was talking about, and more certainty basically in terms of the cost and actually, you know, getting them to the site on time. All these sort of really practical things I think will come about through that fine tuning, I think, of the process.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think, Andrew, thanks for that. You've touched on a really an interesting issue, which, you know, I hadn't even prepared in the questions per se, but you know, will the industry adapt and respond to policy versus the idea of should cities be catalyzing and driving this, you know, through their sort of relationship building with the industry? So without putting you on the spot, Matthew, I'm going to ask you to reflect on that, but also in the context of the question on how can we enable better decision-making when it comes to plant selection and preparation? I think that ties into what I've just said. You know, is it about the city making better decisions when it comes to selection and that driving the industry to supply these appropriate plants that, you know, for the nature-based solutions? And is closer engagement with the ornamental horticulture industry what's missing in this complex system? Matthew, if you can reflect.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I generally think about these things, thinking about the cities and their needs, wants, and plans first off. So I generally think in the context of cities driving what the horticulture industry should do, but that's something that I'm flexible on in my thinking, to be sure. But well, simply better decision-making could mean many things, but to simplify it from where I'm coming from, I think it would begin with a shortening of processes when we're creating preparatory plans for projects using nature-based solutions, ascertaining what parties would be the most suitable partners to work with given our particular plans. And lastly, trying to streamline the actually very complicated process of getting right plants, right place is a buzzword throughout the world, and especially here in New York City, but it's a very complicated process with a nice tagline to simplify it. But a closer engagement with the horticulture industry would definitely go a long way when it comes to plant selection and preparation and guiding these decisions, making them more efficient, hopefully. But it's of course not the only step towards better decision-making in this regard. I think from the city's side of things, a detailed understanding of the landscape specifics, and I'm thinking of the soils, the cultural conditions, and a macro and micro scale, sort of a survey or a cartography of the landscapes that we would be dealing with in our urban environment as a baseline map to draw from, and then factoring into that how climate change will possibly affect these sites. We have models for that. So that's another complication that definitely needs to be thrown in. But this to a large extent would dictate what plants would be used for any of these projects. But this knowledge, or more specifically, this way of gathering knowledge should be collected and made evergreen. And kept as politics proof as possible. I know that's often not possible, but I am a dreamer, so I'll lean into it. And sometimes I think something like a nature-based solution office or a sustainability office, but it's something that has a specifically collaborative mission that includes the horticulture industry, either through consultancy and or cross-employment. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you could go if you get creative, would go a long way to ensuring that our preparations and our decision-making are as detailed and as robust as possible.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. I think that leads perfectly to my next question for Darby. And Darby, I'm going to ask you to respond to what Matthew said, but from the perspective of the industry now. So who should be involved? Matthew, you touched on it from the city's point of view, that the city should be involved in surveying its landscapes, its soils, its natural systems in order to inform the plant selection process. Darby, do you agree with that? Or if you could reflect on what Matthew said, and let's look at it from the horticultural perspective, who should be involved in designing and specifying the nature-based solutions from the perspective of plant selection, and what role should the industry play in that? I think Matthew's really well articulated the role of the city, but what role should the industry play? Over to you, Darby.
Thank you. Yeah, so I mean, first of all, of course, I agree with Matthew. I love hearing about cities talking about their responsibilities for really understanding the landscapes that they are dealing with, and recognizing that we don't have historical reference conditions that we can rely on in what are novel ecosystems essentially for us to be dealing with. So, you know, we really are sort of charting the course as we go here. We're creating new systems that we can't just dig into ecological reference conditions and say, yeah, it looks like this, because you know, while that may help us make some plant selections, it's not the only thing, because the conditions are very different. And we spend a lot of time on soils, and I won't nerd out on soils too much here, but one of the things that, you know, we can't tell people enough is, like, you have to understand what you're planting into. So quality of soil, quantity of soil, substrates, whatever you're looking at, those things are really, you know, they're quite literally the foundation of your urban canopy dreams. So understanding those things is critically important. So I love that, but that is only one part of the story, because we do have all of these plants coming from somewhere. And so, you know, where I see the horticultural industry really playing a strong role is really providing their experiences. I mean, they grow these plants year after year, you know, in various different seasonal conditions through time. And they do have a real wealth of knowledge. Producers know plant tolerances. They have an understanding of plant stress that is a lived experience. And in some cases, you know, they're collecting data, some of the nurseries that I work with, that, you know, we only dream of collecting in a research world, because they've been doing it for decades. So, you know, we need to rely more heavily on those knowledge banks. And where, you know, where I intersect with cities and nurseries in Canada and elsewhere is really in that sort of in-between space, is that we understand that cities have this, they have their own experience where, you know, they're dealing with the landscapes that they're sort of going to install these plants into. And then we have nurseries that are, you know, coming from, you know, a different setting. And oftentimes we're nursing the plants along. We're providing them with all of those things they need to survive and thrive and grow quickly so that they're saleable in the shortest production cycle possible. And, you know, trying to blend those two sets of knowledge is really, really important. So I really hope that, you know, this in-between space is a space where we see more and more integration of those knowledge sets. And it really is a really great example of sort of transdisciplinary knowledge sharing. We have, you know, people like Matthew who are out there working in these landscapes and have knowledge that they can share backwards to the nursery sector, and vice versa. So I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's everybody. Everybody's got to be working in what's, you know, a new space, and, you know, getting more and more new with the experiences that we have with climate change. And so I think it's really important that as we're thinking about changing design standards and nature-based solutions, that we bring all of these people to the table, because it's a really sort of new place for applied research where we need to be working in tandem.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much for that reflection. I think you've hit the nail on the head. And I really like what you said about blending these knowledge bases and navigating that space in the middle. I think that's the space where, you know, through our Green City program, we've realized that there's a huge need in bringing those two voices and getting that interdisciplinary system working well. So Andrew, I'm going to come to you for a second. And I wanted to see, you know, does every city need a botanical garden? What role could botanical gardens play in enabling the Green City movement? You mentioned in your roundtable response that plants were the clients for your Gardens by the Bay project in Singapore. I wondered to see if you could just expand on that briefly, and how might we create infrastructure for people to learn about plants and their role in the urban setting?
Yeah, I mean, it struck me that actually there's very few places in cities that have a focus on plants. You maybe have a garden centre, you maybe have some allotments or community growing spaces where the focus is about growing plants. But actually to sort of have public spaces that are basically inspirational and informative and educational perhaps are really lacking. And I think botanic gardens have the potential to do that. They'd have to be reinvented. I mean, botanic gardens have a sort of a notion that they're ancient sort of places with odd collections of plants, often beautiful, often linked to university or some institutional place. So how do we reinvent that idea that we're creating a sort of a place where you can come and sort of find out about plants, how to look after them, how to rear them, what's the appropriate species for your city, your garden. So I'm really interested in that, and I, you know, Singapore is an interesting reference point in terms of Gardens by the Bay, because they had one of the ancient, not ancient botanic gardens, one of the traditional types, and Gardens by the Bay was set up really as a 21st century botanic garden to inspire Singaporeans actually to bring plants to Singapore that actually would not normally be there. And the whole project was set up around, you know, the plants are the clients. What you're trying to do is create the best conditions for them and to show them off to their best, in their best light. As I say, just the idea of actually learning about plants and actually being inspired by them. And actually as designers, how do we use tools, design effects to actually make people look at plants and go away with a different thinking and thought process about them. It's not just about what they smell like, how colorful they are. It's basically, there's narratives behind that, there's cultural associations, there's ecological links, there's all those sort of aspects about how they grow in different environments. You know, there's a huge opportunity, I think, to create some amazing places through more botanic gardens.
Spot on. And that, you know, that gets me thinking, you know, going back to what Darby just said about that, blending that knowledge in the middle. I wonder if spaces, if we had more spaces like that in the cities, as you call them, public spaces of inspiration. I love that term. And whether those, you know, those could be opportunities to showcase and stand as models for how we meet in the middle there, you know, the industry and cities. So that's really interesting to hear. And thank you for reflecting on that. Matthew, I'm going to come to you. I wanted to, you know, see from your perspective working in a city, could you give your reflections in reflecting on practice? How should cities go about ensuring that they procure, prepare, and plant the right plants in the right places? You mentioned that concept earlier. When implementing nature-based solutions, you know, we really want to address a specific issue, and that, you know, I think it's therefore critical we get that plant selection right. What does this look like in practice? Could you give your reflections and perhaps a practical example to illustrate how collaboration between growers and designers has perhaps resulted in a successful nature-based solution that has addressed the challenge?
Yeah, I can give what I would consider a small personal example. It's specific from a place called Riverside Park, which is one of our larger parks in Manhattan, where I was manager of operations for a number of years. And in that park, erosion is a major problem, almost categorized as a crisis in several parts of the parks, I would say. And for a project, we decided to tackle an area using a volunteer force to help us create drainage wells, swales, channels, and a system that would funnel into basically a large rain garden that I designed and dubbed Fern Gully, if you're familiar with the animated film. If not, it's no problem. But we had a specific plant palette that I was very enamored with. It was chosen by me, and I'd worked it out and thought it was the exact right plants for this project. And I put in an order with one of the few native plant nurseries in our tri-state area. After putting in that order, I got a phone call from someone at the nursery, and just purely to satisfy their own curiosity, they were asking me questions about the project. And this led to more phone calls and a collaboration where whereby based on drawings and photos that I provided of the project, they suggested that they would specialty grow several different species that may function more appropriately for a project like this. And once I got over my bit of ego, I realized that this was this was perfect. I didn't even have to work very hard to build this collaboration, and it led to their suggestions of not only these plants and growing it on a timetable that would work for us, but also the addition of bioengineering materials like salix states and other things they could provide for this certain quadrants of this project. And we were able to work out where it was appropriate, where it wasn't, where we could go with the original plan, and where it needed to be altered very quickly. And boom, we had a successful project. And I feel that it happened simply because an open relationship where questions could be asked and answered thoughtfully and without fear of, well, I was going to say reprisal, but that's not the right word. Fear, just fear. Questions and answers could be given without fear in an environment where, like I said, ego reactions are diminished or neutralized.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. That's a great, I think, example of that meeting in the middle that Darby mentioned. And a great, albeit just at a project scale, I think that gives us a really good frame of reference when we, look at what we would like to enable at a much broader scale. So that's really great to hear, and I wish we had more of those collaborations. Andrew, in your view, are we able to effectively implement urban nature-based solutions and restore habitats without engaging the breeders and producers of plants? Do we need to be, and if not, why not, sort of thing? Yeah, if you could just reflect on that engagement in light of the example that Matthew just gave.
Yeah, different circumstances require different sort of solutions. And there's no doubt there's definitely a school of thought that some nature-based solutions are, in a way, self-generating. You leave an environment to change in its own way, and the biodiversity and the nature benefits come from that. As an example of that, here in Bath in the UK, there are 2 golf courses that in the city that are being given up by the council because they're not efficient to look after, and the debate about how do you make them more biodiverse, and the local wildlife trusts were basically suggesting that, look, okay, you do minimal sort of interventions, you might do a few little plug plants of certain perennials and things, but basically you let it just revert to woodland and grassland in its own particular way with minimal management, minimum plant interventions. But I think, there's no doubt that the vast majority of urban projects need the diversity of species, the quantity of species, the quality of species that the horticultural industry can provide, and we can't deliver everything without that backup.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Peter, I'm going to come to you and ask you from the city perspective, in your experience, is careful plant selection often overlooked in the delivery of city-led nature-based solutions? And if so, why do you think that's the case? How critical is it to ensure that consultation with growers and plant specialists take place, and when in the cycle of implementation, to ensure that plants are integral to the success of the solution?
So I'm going to answer that question in a slightly roundabout way, and it's sort of reflecting back on some of the conversation earlier about sort of collaboration between policymakers and the industry. And one of the things that I just sort of reflecting on while that conversation was going on is what the barriers might be to that. And certainly I think in the UK, one of the barriers is that a lot of policy around urban greening, nature-based solutions at a city level is done by city government and local authorities, not by national government. And there's often a slight squeamishness about developing policy in collaboration with a commercial industry.
Yeah.
There's concerns about what is the commercial industry having too much influence on policy. But actually, on reflection of some of the work I've been involved in, you do need that collaboration, you do need that combination of thought and discussion, because it's about creating the right policy that can be implemented, and it's being implemented by supply chains that sit in the commercial sector. So you do need that collaboration, but local authority politicians in particular are quite reluctant to allow their policymakers to be having conversations with the commercial sector. It's seen as slightly conflict of interest. And I think one of the other big issues, again, this might be a UK issue in particular, is that the nurseries, to scale up to meet the ambition, it's land hungry. You know, you need quite large areas of land to produce the plants that we need for urban greening. And you know, on the edge of London, that land is not cheap. It's not often available. And I guess that's why, perhaps, particularly in the UK, and Andrew might know a bit more about this, is that we either directly or indirectly bring in a lot of our plant material from the Netherlands. Yeah. Because they've had a sort of mature industry, been supplying it for a long time. And we haven't. We've got lots of great niche suppliers, but they haven't got the capacity to scale up to meet the ambition, particularly because those niche suppliers tend to be in quite remote locations where land is relatively cheap and they can operate on quite a small scale. And for them to scale up to meet the ambition of the cities is going to be really difficult. You know, to create a niche nursery on the edge of, sorry, not a niche nursery, a nursery that's providing specialist plant material on the edge of London or Birmingham or Manchester is going to require probably investment from the public sector to provide the land. We do that for other industries, but perhaps we don't do it for horticulture because we don't regard it as an industry, I guess. You know, it's not one of those things where you build a factory to produce the products. Those products are much more organic, and I guess a lot of politicians and policymakers don't recognize that, in a sense, it's no different from producing or supporting the establishment of a factory that's producing PV cells or heat pumps. You need to have that investment to support the industry to scale up.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that. I think you've hit the nail on the head. And it's really interesting to grapple with that thought of, you know, what you mentioned about having an implementable policy, but also engaging with the commercial sector from within the public sector. So, you know, that's a really interesting space to navigate as well. And I guess, again, coming back to what Darby said in that middle area, how that is implemented. But thank you for your thoughts and insights and some of those practical things we need to consider. Darby, I'm going to come to you. In your response to the roundtable, you mentioned that understanding the pathways by which plants go from nurseries to planting is essential. Drawing on your recent work with urban tree value chains in Canada, what are some of the things, in your view, that cities need to consider, and who do they need to consult in order to maximize the benefits that plants provide in their projects? You know, where are there stronger connections and scope for better linkages and relationships within that value chain, as you called it?
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question. So, you know, one of the things that we did was we actually mapped the value chain. So we did a series of interviews and we really tried to understand across the green industry who interacts as part of the urban tree value chain. So obviously cities are sort of the big node within there, but there are lots of other sort of subsectors and actor groups that are part of that value chain. And it's not linear. It's not like a straight line from here to here. And I think that's often the complexity that we've all been talking about, that we try to simplify it into like this tree chain of custody. And in reality, it doesn't really operate like that. And even, you know, the people that we have on the panel today are a good indicator of just where those different sort of actor groups sit in the value chain. And so what we really found was that, you know, cities are obviously a really important piece of the puzzle, but the puzzle also connects, you know, obviously back to the nursery sector. It includes a lot of this sort of middle ground that has to do, in Canada, a lot, like we still have a lot of land development happening. You know, we have, so to Peter's point, we have lots of space for nursery production, and we actually have, a huge land mass. And so we still have a significant amount of development happening where we have new areas being developed. So the development industry is quite significant in the urban tree value chain. And depending on the city, that's where the more complexity comes in. It's procurement is done a little bit differently, and the actor groups that participate in that, in terms of who is dictating, who's hiring who, and who's working with whom, is a little bit different depending on if it's a large sort of dense urban center, or if it's a smaller, more rural type of town or city or village. And so understanding that, that there are these gaps that exist sort of backwards along this was really helping us to map out, not just, where is a tree handed off along that, which includes the landscape sector, contractors, architects, the design sector, and all of those different groups. But it also includes, a significant amount of communication and sharing that needs to be happening backwards along that. And so I think a good example, back to the point about policy, that's a really just it's a practical barrier, has to do with procurement. So just, the procurement policies that cities have really dictate, how and when they're allowed to interact with suppliers. So people that might be, if it's the landscape sector bidding on a project, or if the city does direct supply with nurseries themselves, their procurement policies, I like the term squeamish, but it does really sort of constrain when cities are able to actually talk to those suppliers. And so we've seen that as a big sort of barrier in terms of just, how people are actually working together. And I think that, one of the things we talked about, we don't really consider maybe horticulture as an industry, but I'm not sure that that's even the full story. I think part of it is that we don't recognize that it's an industry that supplies living material, and that's different. It's a lot different than a lot of other industries where cities are doing procurement for something that's fixed, and it's a set number of units. And it takes a set amount of time to supply that. And so, COVID has taught us a lot of things that Maria talked about in terms of our need for a green space. But I think it's also been really interesting because we've seen the demand for green space go up, and we've seen, our nursery stock shortages are at a place we've never seen before. We have no nursery stock supply for the next couple of years in a lot of the Ontario nurseries that I work with. And so they actually see this as a really interesting new opportunity to sort of start fresh with cities. And so, maybe it's a place where we can start to think about how do we do procurement differently with something like this, and trying to, silver linings, I guess, trying to think of this as a positive way that we can sort of reconsider how some of those things that are barriers because we're not working together very well can operate in a different type of space. And you did mention at the beginning, Timothy, that we're working on something called the Greening the Landscape Research Consortium. And based on the work that we did with the urban tree value chain, we tried, after we mapped it and we figured out who's part of it, we brought all of those groups together. And now we're actually setting sort of a research direction as an integrated transdisciplinary across the value chain kind of group, because some of these conversations that we're having here, we're having in that group as well. And we're saying, really, why isn't this working? It seems simple, so there's got to be something there that we're not considering yet. And so, I think that, there's a lot of opportunity for stronger linkages, and certainly just starting the conversation is step one.
Great. Thank you so much, Darby, for those reflections. I'm mindful of time and that we were going to open the discussion to the audience. So what I'm suggesting we do is that we open it now. If there are any questions, if anyone from the audience would like to turn on their camera and ask a question, I'm going to offer the opportunity now to do so. And if no one responds, we can continue with some of the questions I have and a couple I can pick up from the chat box. So I'll just for a moment ask if there's anyone on the call who has a question for any of the panelists, and if you'd like to come on now and ask it, you are welcome to do so. Okay, it doesn't seem like it, so we can continue. I didn't want to shut down our full, discussion and to go into Q&A and then there aren't any actual questions. There is one question in the chat box that Audrey's asked, and the question is there a place for a new profession, a horticultural specialist that contributes to planning and design in the same way that an ecologist or hydrologist might? And that is in very close conversation with nurseries? Or do we expect that landscape architects and urban planners need to simply develop a higher level of horticultural expertise? Very interesting question. I'm going to open it to the floor. So I don't think we'll have time for everyone to respond, but if you have a particular response to that question, any of the speakers, please feel free to respond now.
I was hoping Andrew's going to jump in, but I will instead. No, go on, Andrew, you go first.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. I was going to sort of answer one of the questions, just listing all of the professionals that I work with in a project linked to urban greening. So I think the issue is more about actually landscape architects and people leading projects having a greater awareness of the horticultural consequences of some of these principles that we talked about in a way like Peter was explaining before. How do we engage all of the technical, practical aspects of delivering greening through the projects? So sorry, Peter, you go.
It's something I've been sort of reflecting on, because most of my career I've been in a sort of policy background, but now I'm doing more consultancy on projects and working with design teams. And one thing that strikes me is that it's great that there's a whole range of people now involved in projects, ecologists, horticulturalists, arboriculturalists, hydrologists, all working together. But we're all working together from our own particular perspective. And the thing that fascinates me is that there seems to be very few multidisciplinary consultancies, apart from the really big ones that just have a huge network of consultants who consult on everything. But I'm interested in, Andrew, your perspective in terms of landscape architects. Landscape architecture companies often don't have in-house ecologists or in-house horticulturalists, which always strikes me as slightly odd. Yeah. And also those who understand contracting and maintenance.
Andrew, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I suppose most landscape practices are quite small. It's a reflection of the whole world of landscape as a development and the commercial world, isn't it? In terms of the relative to the mega engineers who manage to sort of generate all these sort of multidisciplinary sort of consultancies.
Yeah.
Basically, I think, from my perspective, I want to be able to work with the best people for that particular project, and we assemble teams around that sort of narrative. And the important thing is, as you say, it's not just all these disciplines sort of going down their own little avenues and not talking to each other or collaborating. You need to sort of generate that sort of collaborative, trust, respect sort of environment. And, personally, the way I've done that is work with people over many years, and you build that amazing team of people that will come up with fantastic answers. But there's not enough of those people to go around at the moment. And so it's not just about creating a new profession. It's about creating multiple of all these other professions who really understand the issues and
perhaps getting suppliers and contractors in those conversations earlier, because I think they're often again they're sort of left to the end. Right, we've done the great designs, we come up with great ideas, great plans. Over to you now, suppliers and contractors. Can you deliver it for us? And they turn around and say, you know what? No.
I don't disagree. I think one of the interesting things over the last few years is the whole world of CPD, and actually the requirement for professions, particularly Landscape Institute and others, to actually deliberately, they have to go and learn about things. You get to get real life, up-to-date knowledge about the issues that affect your work. And certainly in our practice, you know, the horticultural industry coming in and talking about what they're developing, what are the issues that they're doing from different perspectives, whether it's green walls, whether it's trees, whether it's soil, you know, these are all things that are getting better, but they could get even more better.
Yeah. Peter, I'm going to ask you just quickly to reflect on one of the points you made in your response to the roundtable, and that was, you know, not necessarily a new profession per se, but, you know, a new breed of professionals, I think you called it. You know, what would be the role and core competencies of these, you know, as you called them, nature-based solutionists, ecological engineers, urban greening architects, and green infrastructure designers, to coin just a few. I think those were really interesting concepts. And in light of that conversation you've just been having with Andrew, could you just reflect on that a little?
Well, I guess just to sort of follow on from that conversation, we are all, in a sense, constrained by our own expertise and our own professional institutes. You know, I'm an ecologist by training, and I'm a member of the Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management, and Andrew will be a member of the Landscape Institute, that kind of stuff. And we then have to fit in with the principles and objectives of those particular institutions, which, whilst also recognising the need for collaboration, are by their very nature there to defend the interests of their particular members. So it's a fascinating people who are trying to operate in between those different organisations and in between those different disciplines don't really have a home. You know, they're sort of, you could be members of different institutions, but yeah, I think sometimes we are, yes, constrained by our own expertise and institutional memberships.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something we've probably all experienced in our careers. And I think it really speaks to the way, you know, the notion of needing to do things differently. So Maria, I'm going to come to you now, and I'm going to combine two of the questions I had for you into one in the interest of time. But, you know, I really would like you to reflect on this conversation that we've been having in light of, you know, the links between landscape architecture and the horticultural industry. You know, why is it important for that relationship to be, and that connection to be so strong? And perhaps you can give your response by giving us some examples of what careful plant selection might look like in that context, and how, you know, getting those connections to work and having those strong linkages can actually enable really great and wise plant selection. And as a landscape architect, what knowledge is useful to you to inform those decisions within that system?
Yeah, I think that a lot of what you're asking has already been answered, like in different ways, like bits by pieces by everybody else. I think that going back a little bit to the previous question, of course, you know, being a representative of a professional association myself, I mean, I do tend to, you know, obviously favor this profession myself. I mean, that is my job, and I wouldn't really say that we need to have our knowledge be more specific. What I think is what we need to do is we need to broaden our knowledge, right? And I think we need to do that again by collaborating. And I think we need, you know, because I mean, I don't think that the most expert landscape architect doesn't know everything there is to know about landscape architecture, right? I mean, we all tend to focus on one thing or another in our practice that, you know, talks to us more, that we like better. So we tend to focus on that. And I think that we learn a lot from practice and from interaction with other people and with other industries, including the horticultural industry, which I think has so much to teach to landscape architects in so many ways. I mean, Darby was just saying, right? So like the resilience of plants, you know, the tolerance, all of these things that, you know, we see in books and in paper, and, you know, it's not really then in real life, right? I mean, you see once projects are implemented and you see how they span through time and how they last and how how they thrive, but it takes a lot more time for a landscape architect or a designer to learn all of that than a horticultural specialist that has been doing it for decades and has been dealing with it for a much longer time. So I think more than anything, we need to again go back to this collaboration where we can all learn from each other and we can learn to bring each other up, right? So like have this work as a synergy where we all learn from each other and we become better at what we do, rather than divide our expertise to say, well, no, I'm an expert in this or I'm an expert in that. I think it's the opposite. I think we need to learn more about more things so that we can do our job better, because more times than not, our job involves multiple fields. So we just need to, learn from each other. As far as the second part of your question about examples of what a successful nature-based solution looks like, I think that you can see that with time, right? So something that works is something that is resilient and that withstands the time and the effects of climate change is changing. So it's not like you can say what is successful today, because it could be different from 10 years from now. And landscapes are not like a piece of art where you paint and it's done. It's something that needs to last through the years, and so it's something that needs to change with the years. And you just need to become aware of that and be willing to change and to adjust and to adapt. And I think that again, a successful nature-based solution is one that maintains its purpose, its technical purpose, because usually they have a specific purpose, even though they may look pretty, but they have a function, right? So like a proper function. So make sure that function lasts throughout the time while it still maintains the aesthetic quality. So that that it's to me, that's what defines a successful nature-based solution. And I think that again, we're all learning, and even though some have been implemented, a few decades ago, I guess, and we're still learning because everything is changing. So we just need to change and to adapt with time, and just not be set on one way, right? So just be willing to adapt, and just like nature adapts, and we need to adapt. We adapt our knowledge. We just need to learn more from nature.
I think that's perfect in the current context. And, everything you've said about learning from each other, I think is really going to become increasingly important as we face, more climate change related issues in the urban context. What you said about aesthetics versus function, I think is really going to come into play. And I think that that's something that we've said earlier today, that the horticulture industry, has been producing these plants for aesthetic purposes and does really well at that, but, can also produce for functional purposes. And if we were to get that collaboration right, we could maximize and enhance both of those. So before we start wrapping up, Matthew, I want to come to you one more time. And you mentioned in your response to the roundtable the idea of a data repository. I wanted you to just briefly expand on this and whether you reflect on whether you think that might be a useful mechanism that could bring that collaboration to life. And you also mentioned that a better knowledge of plants should come from everywhere. So I wanted to, in that context, ask you what you meant by that, and how does this relate to this conversation we've been having?
Oh, yeah, I could probably talk about that all day. But so piggybacking off some of what has already been said by others, is this sort of fiefdom mentality that can come about when we are, beholden to our own expertise. That's also, there's a component within cities, at least, and probably the horticulture industry, where there's actual bureaucratic walls built up between collaboration and these ideas. So finding a way to get past those to create the plans, and getting out of these bubble decision-making modes of thought we find ourselves in, I think to be able to do that, we have to actually think a lot more simply than just about our own expertise and what we need to do to implement these projects. I think we need to all recognize that collaboration is a skill, and we possess it to greater or lesser degree, depending on several different factors, whom we're working with, whether we know them. Sometimes our collaborations are only minorly successful, but we had a good time doing it, so we expand that outward and say it was a successful collaboration. So I think there's a sociological aspect where people need to be trained and perhaps have someone on board the team who specializes in this sort of thing, of helping people collaborate more efficiently. We can't really learn from each other if we are so beholden to our expertise, as was already mentioned. So perhaps something completely outside of the realms we're already working in, or a person outside of those realms, as I said, might be a way to help create this repository I'm thinking of. It's a repository of knowledge that people bring. And it's, as I've talked about, it should be robust, intelligent, and more of an information sharing system. And I listed in my writing that it should come from plant producers, ecologists, botanists, restoration specialists, landscape architects, horticulturalists, foresters, city planners, gardeners, and probably 19 other titles that we could add to that to create that repository. And that purpose would be specifically just to grow this collective knowledge of useful plants and plant communities in our urban green spaces, and obviously include the horticulture industry there as well. Yeah. And when I say it should come from everywhere, I probably mean different things on different days, but I mostly mean that at the outset, we shouldn't be too picky, or maybe a better word is elitist, about where we gain our knowledge from plants where they work. I place great emphasis on the knowledge of gardeners, perhaps because I was a gardener professionally for much of my life. But to those people on the ground, working with these plants day in, day out, but also working with those plants inside these projects where people interact with it. If the public, and basically being ambassadors for these projects to the public, because without public support, community support, these projects will never get off the ground. The effective quality of nature is something we shouldn't ignore as it pertains to the public. It's critical for garnering support, and these solutions shouldn't be good for you in a medicinal way, but compelling, attractive, and desirable. And a good gardener can really highlight those qualities for the public.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Matthew. That's a really great way, I think, to round up as I come to the final question for each of you. And please, in the interest of time, I'm going to ask that we do a maximum of 30 seconds per speaker. Just as we end off, and this is perhaps a little bit too aspirational, but I really just wanted to hear from each of you in 20 to 30 seconds, a key takeaway for the audience. Reflecting on today's conversation, what is the one thing, we're discussing the need to bridge the divide to ensure the horticulture industry and cities work together. We've been discussing harnessing the power of plants, and all, of course, to achieve our vision of greener, healthier, and more sustainable cities that are fit for the future. So on that note, I'll maybe start with Peter and move through the panel, just your final reflection on that provocation. Thanks. Peter, over to you.
I guess my takeaway, and it's something I wrote in the piece, is about on this point of collaboration, a space where you can have conversations between policymakers, academics, suppliers, specifiers, and others, to really tease out all the complexity in terms of developing policy and implementing policy. In the UK, there's a group called the Trees and Design Action Group, which is brought together by people from the arboricultural community, academics, policymakers. And they've done fantastic work on identifying how trees are thought about in terms of policy and design and implementation. And that, I think that approach needs to be broadened out to the sort of wider horticulture industry. We have got very much focus on trees, but actually we forget there's a whole array of other plants that need to have those similar considerations. So I think my idea was like a horticulture design action group to bring those people together.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I'll go to Andrew next.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think, although I was aware of it, I think the big thing that's come across to me is actually just really getting a sense of the scale of the challenge to actually upgrade horticulture industry to meet the challenges of new species, quantity of species, quality of species. How do we achieve that? And it seems to me that one of the things would be really helpful would be to have a real urgent sort of cross-disciplinary consensus on what are the priorities, across the industry, across all of the people engaged with this. What are the priorities for delivering this horticultural supply chain?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. I'll go to Darby next.
Sure, thank you. So as a researcher, certainly one of the key areas of focus is for us right now is really on evidence-based decision making. So, really identifying where the gaps are and helping to fill those out so that, people in cities and elsewhere can be relying on that, that empirically derived knowledge base. But I do want to sort of underscore the thing that Matthew said around where knowledge comes from. I think it's really important that we're actively seeking out knowledge that exists out there. We have people that have these, have institutional knowledge and other kinds of knowledge that, is really, really critically important. And I really like the idea of sort of tapping into that more and more. And just one final thought, seeing is believing. I love where I see research demonstration sites out collaboratively with cities. We've been doing a lot of those. So working on parkettes with nature-based designs, with signage and resourcing, so people, the public can actually interact with real-time kind of living lab types of spaces. We find those things to be very effective to bring the public along with the conversation at the same time.
Yeah. Great, thank you, Darby. I love that, actively seeking knowledge. Great. Matthew, if I can turn to you for your final reflection.
I'll be a little bit repetitive and then just sort of say that, yeah, I think that by designing these projects, I do think they need to start with evidence-based techniques and knowledge, but never forgetting to weave in that the emotions that these sorts of projects bring, especially again through the public, is critical. And knowing that eventually we will need to interact and quote unquote sell these projects using people's emotions, our own, hopefully, and synthesizing them with the community at large to make these projects not just functional and beautiful, but something much larger than anyone ever envisioned them to be.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for that. And Maria, you were the one I started with, and we'll end with you and your reflection. Thanks.
I would like to end not answering your question. I'm sorry about that, but there was just something that I thought was important to say. Andrew mentioned the botanical gardens and their role in educating the community in general. And I think that we should focus on that, the teaching of the community by, going to schools and focusing in schools first, so that, what we've been talking about, how we should have thought about that before. I think that is the thing. We should start with the children and explain to them the roles and the benefits of the plants and the nature-based solutions and how we can achieve a better urban environment by introducing nature. And I think that, when you get the children, involved in all that, and when they believe in that change, then that's when change happens, because, policy happens a lot faster when you have the community demanding for it. And so I think that, I think it's important for us to focus on teaching the children and all of this, the knowledge from, the horticultural company, all of these practitioners that we talked about, and all of these people, they need to teach and share their knowledge with the children so that they can be the future. And I'm not trying to be like a catchphrase, but I just think that, it's really important to think about that beforehand, not just teaching them math and English and, teaching them the roles of plants and how they really are important to us.
I completely agree. And I think that's a perfect way to sum it up, bringing it back to that first question I asked you around our connection to nature. And, how really all of this is really about restoring that. Matthew, you mentioned the emotional aspect of that. I think, as we connect to nature, not as something we're that's external to us, but really we, in a session we'll be doing on Wednesday, we call it rewilding of people, not just cities, but internalizing that idea and bringing it back to that simple fact. And I think, as you've said, Maria, starting in schools and with children it would be a great start. So to quote what Darby, using some of her quote, I just want to thank everybody today for actively seeking knowledge with us and being in the session. I think each of the topics we've covered and each of the responses could be fleshed out in a session on its own, but we do have to end somewhere. And I hope that, before I conclude, we're just going to do a second poll. So I think Audrey has put it in the chat. And if we could just click the Menti link there and all just quickly vote on that. I'll give a few seconds for that before I conclude. As you finish that, I'll just pick up on something that Andrew mentioned about the scale of the challenge. I think this is something, that we are more and more confronted with every day, and something that is really, driving and inspiring so many different professions and professionals to do the work that they do. And really, this is, I think, the start of a longer term conversation, perhaps the establishment of what Peter called the Horticultural Design Action Group, where we'd hope to see all of you actively involved. But I think this has been a really exciting conversation to have. And thank you all for joining us. We're going to skip the third live poll as I conclude now. I just wanted to really encourage anyone on the call to please reach out to us. Reach out to us on the email addresses that are on your screen now, our website. We'd love to hear from you. This is a conversation that I think is very slowly taking shape and starting to find its roots, but really an essential conversation, or certainly as AIPH, we see it as being critical and central to enabling the success of the Green City movement globally. So it's really a conversation we look forward to taking further with each of you. And I just want to really take this opportunity to thank you all for joining us today and being with us. Maybe what I'll do, I'll put the third poll. I think Audrey's put the link in the chat. I'll put it up for anyone who is interested. Just as we conclude, I'll leave it up for 30 seconds. But as I close, I just firstly want to really take a moment to thank each of our speakers. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you for taking the time and for sharing your insights. I think it's really, I've certainly been challenged personally and learned a lot from each of you. So thank you not only for your responses to the roundtable, but for fleshing those out in a bit more detail today. We really do appreciate it, and we look forward to continuing to collaborate with you all as we navigate this complex space. And as we find a way that essentially we can have the same vision of building greener and more sustainable cities. That being said, thank you to everybody on the call who's joined us. A huge thank you to TNOC for offering the platform and the space. And I hope that everyone on the call will really enjoy the rest of the festival in the coming days. I know there's lots to look forward to, and yeah, so thank you for a wonderful session, everyone. We really appreciate it, and we hope to speak soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Timothy.
Thank you all. Good day.